Okay, so I need to take a practice break, and I wanted to make a quick video addressing a question that came up on Reddit some weeks ago. Um, the poster had asked if learning to sight read well made it harder to memorize. And it was basically framed this way because the poster's teacher could sight read really well, and she had said that she found memorization more difficult, yet the student found sight reading very difficult, but memorization easy. So you can kind of see where a beginner might see some weird causal link there, but I'm going to say that's not the case, and no, learning to sight read does not make it harder to memorize. What's really going on here is there's an issue of perceived relative difficulty, because for somebody who reads well, memorization becomes an extra step, and so that does make it seem more difficult. And in reality, the skills that make you a better sight reader will also make you a better memorizer, even if you don't actively use memorization as a skill, which honestly most working musicians don't. Now, to be better at sight reading, you need to be able to chunk chords together from individual notes. You need to have some theory understanding and be able to see progressions and patterns in the music, probably have a decent understanding of form. All of those things help you to be a better sight reader, but they would also make you a much better memorizer. So let's compare this to the thing I usually use as an analogy. Great analogy for anything music or music pedagogy is language and language learning. So let's say that I gave you several paragraphs of text to read out loud to an audience, and put them on a piece of paper in front of you and said, just read this aloud. You could probably do that, and you would do so with very natural inflection, probably, barring the fact that you might have some sort of learning disability that makes reading difficult. This is easy for most people. Now, if I said to memorize those several paragraphs and then recite them to the audience, you'd probably think that was a little bit more difficult. That'd give you some pause, because that takes preparation. You would actually have to sit down and spend time memorizing instead of just reading it out loud. And you'd probably be more comfortable having the words in front of you. But obviously, being able to read would not make it harder to memorize that text. It would make it much easier, because you could look at words, and it's not just a bunch of individual letters. You chunk them together into words, and you actually know what those words represent. You would understand full ideas from sentences. You would be able to see, you'd probably be able to summarize the entire gist of the several paragraphs, maybe give a main idea for each paragraph. Those kinds of things would help you mentally organize and contextualize what's happening so that you can memorize the words verbatim to read them or to recite them to an audience. So obviously, reading makes you better at memorizing, or makes it easier to memorize, but still memorization would be more difficult than just reading it, because it's an extra step that you have to take. So perceived relative difficulty. Now, if I gave you a couple of paragraphs in a foreign language and I asked you to memorize those and recite them to a group of people, that'd be pretty difficult, because you wouldn't have any of those context things to help you. You wouldn't know what any of the words meant or represented. You wouldn't know what the general idea of the paragraphs were. None of that would make any sense to you. And so it would be much harder for you to memorize. But if I asked you to read out loud from that foreign language in front of people, you'd probably say nope, because that would be even more difficult, because you probably wouldn't even know how to pronounce half the words. So in that case, because you have no skill in that language, While memorization would be very difficult, it would still seem much easier than trying to just read it off the page. And so that's pretty much the exact same thing with music. For beginners, it is a foreign language, and it's very difficult. And a big part of it is that, you're just going to have to memorize as a beginner to a very large degree because you have zero technical skill. But on top of that, you are lacking a lot of things that advanced musicians take for granted. Just simple stuff like identifying and naming notes on the staff, knowing what key that represents on the piano, knowing things about key signatures and time signatures and the length of different, rhythmic values. Those are all things that take up your mental bandwidth, not to mention just the pure technical facility issues of not quite knowing all the key distances very well in your hands. They're not comfortable. You're probably going to want to look at your hands more, whereas a better sight reader would not look at their hands pretty much at all because they can feel those distances. They know what they feel like. But as a beginner, you can't feel those distances. You don't know what that feels like. You don't know what it feels like for it to be correct. And so you need repetition. Early on, you need way more repetition. And as a result, you just end up memorizing through osmosis. Now, what I will say is that you want to get away from that as soon as possible because the insidious thing about this perceived relative difficulty issue between sight reading and memorization is that if you use memorization as your primary mode of learning consistently and you neglect your sight reading will seem even more difficult consistently over time. Just the more distance you give it, it will just get weaker just because the other one's stronger. So I would really urge beginners not to neglect their sight reading. It's probably the skill, especially on piano, that takes the most amount of time to develop. It develops very, very slowly. And so you need to start it really, really early. The big upside about starting early is that sight reading is unique to a lot of other skills on piano. If you're doing things like learning your scales, your scales will get fast kind of quickly, and then for advanced players, you would be struggling to even make 5 beats a minute faster in progress because you hit a point of diminishing returns where you are up against a physical limit. Sight reading is the opposite, where it starts way more difficult, but the better you get at it, the more you hit a tipping point where you're reading more information faster, and just because you can do more of it, you're able to take in a greater volume of music, and really it's the volume of sight reading in the sweet spot that really ends up improving your sight reading more than anything. And the sooner you start working on sight reading, the better that'll be, also because if you do it when you're already fairly fresh and new, and it's not so far beyond or behind your maximum level already, you'll still have that little bit of joy that comes from the newness of the experience, and you will more greatly appreciate the little advancements that you're able to make just with sight reading. You'll feel that in a way that a lot of times people who neglect their sight reading and get very good, they don't feel that as much, and then sight reading is just a purely grueling experience for them. So as much as a beginner as sight reading might seem difficult, I would highly encourage you to dedicate some time every day to doing it, because you're at a point where that sweet spot, it's it's not in a frustrating place relative to your absolute playing level. And it will really help you a lot, a lot, a lot. Whether you plan to play professionally, which, you know, almost, well, I would say almost nobody does, but mostly I would say almost nobody should. I do not recommend it as a career path. But no, even if you're going to play as a hobbyist, sight reading is one of the skills that will let you just sit down and play at the piano, which is really important as you get older and have less time, because adults just are going to have less time, less free time to tinker around. And if you rely on memorization, and especially if you rely on the sort of brute force physical memorization that a lot of people fall into, that becomes a thing that you really can't do as an adult. You won't have the time to do it, and it won't feel rewarding. And so you'll end up being one of those people who used to play piano, which I hear all the time, and it's almost always because of this. There are other skills, that you could also learn that would let you just sit down and play. But I really think that sight reading is the skill that opens the most doors to more resources and lets you get the most enjoyment out of piano in the long term as a hobbyist. But also, it is absolutely crucial for anybody who wants to play as a career. So, sight read.